if people have questions, things like that, we are actively using the chat for this, and so please feel free to type questions, notes, comments, or if you want to reinforce a point that I'm making, I'm happy to see it echoed in there. And so, Alan, I'm going to pause as I go and let you throw in commentary and some background and where things are going.
Yeah, take the lead, dude.
Cool. So this topic is something that has been a burning topic in OpenStack for, I lost my camera feed, for as long as I can remember. It's been, I can remember back at sitting in Boston having a discussion about what is OpenStack and what the required pieces were. And so it's something that was put into the board's charter from the very beginning, in the foundation charter, to define what OpenStack was in a functional way, meaning that it was something that we could use as an ongoing test and that people could count on being an understood definition. And it's very important as a background to understand why we want to define what OpenStack core is. And it hasn't actually been particularly clear even why it's important. And I've done a lot of writing, Alan's done a lot of writing about this, and there's ultimately a chart that we had produced. I'm going to try and flash it up on the screen because it's useful from a perspective to understand just how complex a chart we built in doing this. Let's see. Because it really had been generating quite a bit of frustration and angst within the within the board and also within the community. Screen share this. So this is a picture of a whiteboard in which Alan and I spent several hours trying to sketch out all the places where there's tension and confusion and just things that were making it hard for OpenStack to work. And the reason why that was so difficult was that it was really a place where we were trying to find the right balance between innovation and stability, commercial interests and open source interests, and it had this really challenging effect of trying to match everything together. And what we found was that if we couldn't really describe what was important in OpenStack and what was going to be a core capability, then the community had a lot of trouble understanding, what they could count on being reliable, where they could innovate, where new changes were coming, and it was making it very hard to participate in OpenStack. And so a lot of what we're talking about with core is making it easier for our commercial entities to collaborate and participate. OpenStack is funded by a lot of commercial entities, but also to make it more straightforward for our community and our users and the operators to know what they can count on, what's going to be stable, what they have to have in order to be OpenStack. So does that sound like a good preamble, Alan?
Yep, that was awesome. I didn't realize you still had the that spider diagram.
I bring it out to scare my children at night. Yes. It's appropriate. We should decorate it for Halloween. And a lot of times we'll talk about this discussion as the spider diagram because there was a point at which we had in the board meeting. This was I'm trying to remember which board meeting. I guess it was Portland.
No, it was Portland. Yeah.
Where we were getting into a point where the board was going in circles. Somebody said, "Well, this is core, that's core now," and we put together this effectively a mind map to try and resolve that as a problem, or try and resolve where the tensions were so we could move forward. And from there, we came up with a very long list of questions, things that we thought were important that the spider chart had exposed. We discussed that with the board. We brought in the technical committee about this and started to really try and refine, sort of what we learned from the spider chart. And we learned a lot of things from the spider chart. It's good to go back to it. And what we learned from spider chart and refine that back into something more more specific. And if you go back through I've been blogging about this, and we actually started with, I think, 14 or 13 positions. And then we've been refining that down into something much more concrete and digestible through this process. And so the point we are in the process is there's two important things to note. We're not the goal of this meetup is not to define what is core. We are not in any way asking people to say, I think this is core, or I think that is core right now. What we're trying to do is define a process by which we can make those statements. It's a little bit slow. It's how the board sort of needs to make sure that we build consensus. So the idea is that at the November board meeting, we're going to vote on using this template or a modified version of this template based on community feedback as the mechanism for providing core, defining core. And then we'll start on actually using that mechanism to define core over the next release cycle. So hopefully by the time we're meeting for the Icehouse release, we'll actually know which components in Icehouse are core or not. And even better, I'm hoping we'll be able to go back to Havana and say these are core things in Havana or not based on these rules. During the conversation, what I do want us to do is actually test it. So it's perfectly legitimate to say, well, if core is defined in this way, then this piece would be or this piece wouldn't. So it's really helpful to pressure test the core definition to see if it's going to give results that we think are good or not in it. But we're not going to end up today defining core or not defining core. All we're trying to do is figure out what process we use to make those decisions. And so we're expecting that decision to come at the November board meeting, which is the day before the summit, and thus we're trying to get community input about the process. Phew. And then I'm about to spend the next 10 minutes actually describing the process that we have that we've been sort of refining, that we think is pretty close, so we can get community input on it. And then we'll spend the rest of the 90 minutes discussing the ramifications of that and how that goes. Alan?
So do we need to talk about why core is important? Does everybody understand or have questions on that?
Excellent. Some of that will probably come up. And one of the things I always start with in describing this flow chart is that one of the biggest tests, there's a couple of tests that we'd like to apply for this, but the top one, in my opinion, when we look at these core definitions, is whether or not...
Hey, Rob?
Yes.
Rob, I just thought of one other thing we should point out, because there was a lot of effort put in, and we want to make sure it doesn't look like this is just you and I.
Thank you.
A previous effort to this, as Rob pointed out, we were at a board meeting basically reviewing the results from the incubation committee, which had worked on this topic previously. We called it InkUp, and that committee was made up of board members and TC members, several project leads, and a few people from the community. And the result of that effort is what Rob and I used as input, and the board used as input to start the spider effort. Also, the result of that incubation effort, we actually updated the incubation process, which we now use, which the TC uses to guide new projects, and some of the determinations they use to decide what projects are ready to go into incubation and so forth. So this has been a long process, and I think it's had pretty good visibility for many, many months. So anyway, go ahead, Rob.
No, I'm glad you're bringing that up. This has been something we've been working on for quite a long time, and we've gotten a lot of input throughout the process. And this is what we want to be respectful of people's time. We're not presenting this. We do have a small set of core definitions. I'll give you the link so you guys can read ahead while we ramble on with preamble.
Let me chime in there for a second, right? So to start from the very beginning, I mean, the fact that it's crucial to define what is OpenStack code and what not, I mean, that's a foregone conclusion, right? I mean, I get this question from a lot of customers, at least a couple of times a week, right?
Exactly.
However, what I cannot necessarily say, and at least from my side, is that I am up to date of where we are in that process, right? The only thing that I can say, and again, take this as an example of one, is that I know there are efforts in defining what is OpenStack core, right? And unfortunately, sideshows like the AWS API quote-unquote debate and things like that have much more profile than the foundation efforts in defining what is OpenStack core. And again, take this as a sample of one. But if you ask me right now, I have no clue where we are as a community in defining what OpenStack code is or it's not.
And we'll be very specific about this I'm going to go through what we have for the flowchart. This flowchart we're expecting to be adopted in this form or something close to it at the board meeting in November. And then we'll start implementing that. We actually have a timeline that we're going to propose for implementing it that allows us to go to Havana and Icehouse and define core. So we'll.
Sorry for a dumb question. I mean, maybe just as me with Google Plus. Are you sharing that flowchart somewhere? Or
I'm about to.
Okay.
And then if the link in IRC will take you, the OpenStack core positions will take you to that flowchart. If you want to read ahead. So
and I should point out this flowchart. Rob's blogged about it. We've posted it before, so it's not new. It's been out for a while.
Correct. But
you updated it, Rob.
Right. And at the same time, it's also something that is not set in stone. So we are taking feedback about it. We're trying to refine, make sure that we've covered the contingencies, and so.
Well, and I appreciate the feedback we got. I agree. So when we get the results from the board meeting, we definitely want to make demonstrate a timeline so that people can see when things are going to start to roll out.
The challenge with the timeline is that a fast timeline will take more effort by the members and the foundation, and we need to make sure that we have the resources necessary to do that. And that'll make sense as we go through the details.
Yep.
Before I finally go through the flowchart, the thing I would ask you to think about in this is not just the technical aspects and the implementation, but one of the things that's been very important in the discussions, both with the community, but also especially with the board, is the behavior that this drives. So there's, in everything we do, we need to make sure that we don't create a gamification system or something that discourages the behaviors that we think drive the open source community forward. And that's actually been a big part of these discussions, and it's one of the things that made the core conversation very hard. And as we go through this, there's aspects to this core definition that have evolved specifically because they were intended to drive certain behaviors for the community. And that's been a really big factor in thinking this through. And I would ask everybody, as you look at it, to not just think through the technical aspects to it, but also the community and culture behaviors that we're trying to encourage in OpenStack around upstreaming, around collaboration, around innovation, but also having a stable base. So a lot of sort of contrary views that we're trying to accommodate with this, and that's why the spider was so hard to lock in, is because we have these things where we want a stable base, but we want to encourage innovation. We want commercial interests to be successful, but we want to encourage upstreaming. And so those sort of different quadrants need to find a common ground in this definition. And that's been a big part of what we want people to think about and pressure test as they listen to the definition of what we're talking about. All right, that was a lot of preamble. And I should have... Can everybody see that? And if you want just the high view, I'm posting that in the background. Now I see. All right, so this starts on the top right. Alan, please, or if you have questions, please hold the questions because it really works well.
End in 30 seconds.
If we go in a flow, nobody's listening in the join me, so it's probably going to shut down by itself. Actually, I'm just going to stop it before I start. So, okay. So, yeah, please let me run through this. It takes 5 or 10 minutes at most to do that. Alan, of course, if you have clarifications.
Sure. No, go ahead.
So here's the deal, and this is backed up. Everything on this is backed up by more text on that web page that's in the IRC in the IRC page. The idea is you start in the top right, and fundamentally what we've been talking about as a preamble is that the implementations that use core can claim the OpenStack trademark. So the trademark is really the foundation's strongest weapon against having people do anything at all. And so being able to say you are OpenStack and enforce that trademark is really the thing that we're working about defining, right? So that's a lot of what this is, and there's commercial drivers to be able to enforce that. Then what we're saying is that of that, core is just a subset of the whole project. If you're not core, it doesn't make you less OpenStack. We have a lot of integrated projects. We have a lot of incubated projects. There's things that are coming in. They're not core. They can't be core until they're fully integrated, no matter what. And even within the integrated projects, it's not entirely clear which of those are core or not core. So core is a subset of the whole. And there's rationale for that being something we want to be. And then the other thing that's important is that we don't want to create a core that is core for hosters and core for private cloud and core for Asia-Pac clouds and core for US clouds and core for high-performance compute. We're creating one definition of core in this. There's an active thread about this conversation around extending that, but for this discussion, we're looking for a definition of core that works for everybody. Okay, so that's sort of a set of positioning statements. From there, we get into technical implementation items. This next item is a significant one that causes some people to think very hard. The idea is that we're requiring the use of designated code frameworks. So OpenStack, some of the projects have plugins, some of them have extension models. There's different ways to do this. Some of them, like Oslo, which is the base common library, probably don't, you have to use them. They're core in themselves because they rely on everybody else. But the idea here is that we didn't want to use the word plugin or extension or any technical implementation. We wanted to say that in OpenStack projects, there will be a section of the code that the leads, technical leads on that project say is required code. You must use this part of the project. And so that is a require. If you're going to be core, you must use the parts of the project that are designated as required. From there, we start having some flexibility. On the left side, the projects must have an open reference implementation. So it's not required code, but the functionality of the system is demonstrated using an open source open reference implementation. So an OpenStack reference implementation. And you could also have a reference, an implementation that was substituted in another way. So this says vendors. It could actually be another project. You could implement it two different ways. The idea is that it is perfectly acceptable to have an alternate implementation in the designated areas for functionality. So a simple example is using KVM instead of Zen or Hyper-V. Those are alternate implementations of the virtualization engine. Some of the projects have very clear boundaries on this and plugins where you can swap out the storage backends in Cinder or the network implementations in Neutron. Those are very clear boundaries, and that's what we're trying to accomplish here. So the goal is you can run OpenStack completely open because we have a reference implementation, and you could also substitute in alternate capabilities, and that would also be acceptable. It's an and in this case, not an or, because we require a core project would be required to have an open reference implementation. Then the next layer down from that jumps into, well, okay, great. We've got code, we've got required code, we've got substitutable code. How do we know what's working or not? So that jumps into the testing area. So we have an expectation that the code will be verified by open community tests. And so that's pretty straightforward. We see a huge growth in this. It's a really important part of the community through Tempest, and there's other test suites. And that those tests can be remotely or self-administered. So it should be. And what that means is that we don't want to create a certification body for OpenStack that you then have to go pay somebody to say, yes, I am core or not core, or that you have to be online in order to validate these tests. That you can run this suite of tests against your deployment and validate that it conforms to OpenStack core code. And that's been something that we've seen is really important. Also generates some interest because there's a question about how we certify and things like that. I'm sure we'll discuss that. Once we have these tests that can be administered in a consistent way, then some of those tests will be identified by the foundation as must-pass tests. The foundation bylaws actually stipulate that it's the board's job to make those certify those final selections of what's core or not core. In this case, the board would actually be certifying which tests are must-pass tests or not. Although we've been discussing different ways to identify what is a must-pass test. But so of the body, there's over 700 Tempest tests. So if we just use Tempest, then a certain percentage of those would become must-pass. Of those must-pass tests, passing those tests with either the reference implementation or an alternate implementation would mean that you can claim to be core. So if you have an implementation and you can pass all the must-pass tests in your implementation and you're using the designated code frameworks, then you can claim the OpenStack trademark. Okay. And that takes us back to the trademark and where things are going. Alan, do you have something to add in that description?
No, that was a great description. Especially like that you pointed out that just because something's not core does not diminish its value, and that was a big part of the focus on the discussion of the incubation process, because we wanted to make sure that we didn't diminish the importance of all projects.
Right. There's. What I can do we've had this discussion now in a couple of different groups, and if it's helpful, I'll point out some of the things that we know generate some discussion, and then I'll open it up. We know that people want to spend some more time talking about the requirement to use designated code frameworks, and some of the thinking behind that. We have some people on the board who are very, very strong proponents of that because what it does is it really encourages people to contribute back to OpenStack. So the idea would be if Keystone's a good example. If you're not using Keystone, if we don't require use of Keystone as parts of Keystone, then it will effectively become sidelined project because somebody else could introduce an alternate Keystone, and that would effectively make the OpenStack Keystone project wither away from BitRot because somebody else had come up with a complete substitute. So in this reading, in this definition, this proposal, you couldn't re-implement, say, Keystone, assuming Keystone becomes core, and use a completely non-OpenStack version of Keystone that passed the tests and still claim to be an OpenStack deployment. And the rationale for that is back to culture. We want to make sure that people are contributing back to the OpenStack project and the code and making the code in the project better, rather than using the tests to create alternate implementations of OpenStack for that. So that we should set aside some time to talk about more. And then another one that people tend to talk about and want to discuss more is about about conformance and validation. So if tests can be self-administered, how do we make sure that we're enforcing the OpenStack, the OpenStack brand in this case? And our expectation is that the market is going to be pretty unforgiving of a vendor or anybody who puts together something where they claim OpenStack core and you can't actually self-run the tests and pass them. So ultimately OpenStack and lawyers can get involved in things like that. That would be a last resort. I would expect that if a company put together an OpenStack product that didn't pass the core tests but claimed they were OpenStack, that they would be the market would punish them sufficiently for that. And the same is true with version-to-version compliance. So while there isn't anything in here that says if you pass Grizzly but then fail Havana, how are we going to deal with that? Once again, we expect the markets to put pressure on people who pass in one version to not claim that it's an automatic forward pass, because the markets would be pretty unforgiving. Okay, I'm gonna stop and turn it. Those are the places where we've always spent a lot of time in discussion, and so it's worked.
So Rob, I think one other thing, maybe this isn't that important, but the blue areas. One of the things that Rob and I spent a lot of time talking about was we have a couple tensions in here. One is we want to enable innovation, but we're also looking for stability. So stability and innovation sometimes are at odds. And the blue section here is to help resolve that tension by giving us stability, but also enabling community to continue to innovate.
Right. And one of the things about that innovation is we want to encourage the innovation to include testing. So another cultural benefit in this is that we want OpenStack to be the most tested project out there. Our hope is that in looking at how we're doing this, it really encourages projects to show up with good test suites that exercise functionality, so that if you're an incubated project and you show up with you have every motivation to show up with a suite of tests. And Matt, I would actually, your question in IRC about how projects might be removed from core is really interesting along those lines, because what we're expecting is that we will start tracking percentage of tests passing for the whole suite, not just core, the whole suite of OpenStack projects at different sites. And as a new project starts passing more tests, we can actually track that it's on track to become part of core. And the same is true if we have a project or a set of tests that are not passing as often, then we could track them as likely coming out of core. One of the things that Alan and I identified in the Spider very strongly is OpenStack's bias towards implementation over API referencing. And so we are really a very empirical and a very implementation focused community, which I appreciate a lot. And so we felt that any core definition should include a way to say, well, what's actually going on in the field? What are people actually doing? Rather than having people in a star chamber at a summit make a decision.
Yep.
I'm pausing for questions. This is a topic I've put a lot of energy into, and I'd happily can keep talking about things. But Alan, do you have some observations or points you want to make?
No, I think you've done a good job here. I'm very interested just to get everybody's feedback.
And so for IRC, for questions, if you want to do them from IRC, that's awesome. I think that if take over the audio channel, that's fine. I have all the mics open. We don't have such a big crowd that's a problem.
Hey, sorry, this is Matt. It might be a little kind of too low level, but you brought up testing, but I was just curious about any documentation requirements, and it's something I'm not sure how it can be measured, like tests can be measured from a must-pass standpoint, but in order to be core, has documentation come up as a concern for core?
So Rob and I talked about documentation, but it's as you point out, how do we measure that? We weren't quite sure how to measure that quality.
Or maybe it's around a docs team being assigned or created, so it becomes.
But that's part of the incubation process.
Okay, cool.
But
right?
I would.
So
Go ahead, Alan. Sorry.
no, I was just going to say. So I'm with you. I just don't know how to measure it.
So here's one of the things that really is interesting on this, and we've gone around and around a lot in other discussions here, is that it really comes back to what you test and what passes. So the idea is that we're going to define these must-pass tests based on which tests are passing in the field and what things are useful. So if we find that docs are, if people write tests for docs and they pass, I'm not entirely sure how that would work. But if we do that and they pass, then it makes perfect sense that they would be included in the definition of core. It ends up being a little circular. We have a huge body of work and a lot of tests that we can take advantage of for this. So, in a lot of cases, what things are core or not core are really defined by which tests are available and are passing in the field based on people's actual implementation choices. And this is what's important. We're using tests in a sort of a weird way. We're not validating that the code works or doesn't work. We're using tests as a check to see if people have implemented the use case the test is checking. So if you had a test that was specific for Hyper-V, and that perfectly, I'd love to see a lot of Hyper-V specific tests because people who deploy Hyper-V want to validate that it works in their site. If they run those tests and they pass and they report back to OpenStack that those tests are passing, then we will have data that shows, in 10% of OpenStack deployments, this, Hyper-V passes. And then we'd actually be able to use that to decide if it was a core or not a core capability, right? And so we're really using tests, and the purpose of tests is to validate which use cases are in effect in OpenStack deployments as a way to gauge what's core. And so jumping all the way back to the docs question, if everybody's deploying the documentation and there's a way to test that, then that would become a must-pass test because everybody was implementing the documentation.
Gotcha. Okay.
It's interesting. The TCs actually get a little hung up on this because they look at the tests very much as checking functionality, not as a test for whether or not somebody's implemented capability. I live in deployment world, so we use Tempest as a baseline to see if we've installed correctly.
Gotcha. Okay.
This is Jeff here. I think let me bring the elephant into the middle of the room. Um, and the elephant in the middle of the room, as far as I can see, is clearly Swift and the alternative object storage systems.
Yes.
And one of the concerns that I have is that, to some extent, a lot of the discussion so far has revolved around sort of codifying the state of the world at a particular point in time. If at the time that OpenStack had started, there had been 2 or 3 vibrant object storage systems out there, then we would have naturally looked at that. I hope we would have looked at that and said, oh, well, this is in the same situation that we have with hypervisors or with networking gear, and so we will naturally design our OpenStack architecture and our conformance thinking around the fact that this is an area that has to be pluggable. But for whatever reason, that was not the case, and there were both company reasons and sort of point-in-time reasons why that was not the case. And the trouble is that once you do that, once you bake that in, it seems very hard to go back. It's very hard to undo that particular very early binding. This is why I have always been a strong proponent of an interface-based conformance model, simply because we know that works from looking at things like Linux and POSIX and other areas.
Right. And this is an interesting compromise from that perspective, because these tests are going to be testing the interface, and so you could pass all these tests and claim be OpenStack compatible. We are specifically not addressing that question at this point. One of the rules in here about requiring designated code frameworks actually specifically blocks you from being able to claim core if you just pass the interface tests. Swift is an interesting question, and so there's a couple of places where it's fun to talk about how it's going to be impacted by core. These definitions would encourage any project to find ways to be pluggable and extend themselves. And in Spider, we found that pluggability was actually one of the first concerns, and we've spent a lot of time talking about the importance of pluggability for OpenStack projects as a way to encourage innovation in exactly the way you're describing. If there were multiple object storage approaches, then the architecture would have been approached differently. I think that's a fair statement. And so these core definitions would encourage a new incubated project to look at the definitions and say, wow, I better think about pluggability right from the start and build that into my framework, which is a good behavior, in my opinion. And I've heard that echoed in other places. As far as Swift goes, and John Dickerson was at one of our first meetups on this, and he's been involved as a TC, obviously. The challenge that this gets into is some projects that are considered core now might not be core simply because they're not implemented in as many sites. So I think that we're going to start looking for data to see what tests does Swift have. This encourages people like Rackspace who have a body of internal tests for Swift to start making them open. And then looking at which customers have implemented Swift and which ones passed the tests, and then that helps us define if there is sufficient implementations of Swift for it to be considered a core project or not. So once again, back to implementations, empirical data helping drive this decision. And then John was talking about Swift has specific operational characteristics that he thinks is critical to making this successful, and so that would be potentially white box tests instead of black box tests. There's all sorts of things. So the more tests we have, there's no reason why we can't have white box or black box tests. There's everything we bring in, we can then start to wind through this. Does it pass in the field? If it passes in the field, then it's something we want to consider as core because people depend on it. Right, and that's ultimately we're taking this decision where it's technical implementation validation, and we're moving it into in our user base and our operators. Do they count on these capabilities being present? And if they count on these these things being present, then we need to make sure that they're reflected in core. And if they don't, then we want to know why, and we want to know what the trend lines are, and how to, that's also good feedback.
So, and in terms of depending upon these capabilities being present, there is a distinction between depending upon a capability implemented with a particular code base being present, and depending on a capability exposing a standardized interface being present, right? I mean, so that's the we have that already with the hypervisor and other areas, So earlier on the IRC, I asked whether we had a body of sort of work definitions, and it really, I was not referring to the flowchart and the criteria and the other pieces in your excellent blog thread. What I was really trying to think, have we actually gone through the thought experiment of saying, okay, here's the process, here are all the criteria, here's the flowchart, let us generate one or two opinionated documents which might plausibly reflect the outcome of that process, and then take a look at that and say, okay, once we followed the process, we generated this prototype. Let's critique it. Let's understand what its strengths and weaknesses are, what it doesn't do to move our the subjective forward, and then go back and test and maybe refine the process.
That's an excellent suggestion.
Yeah. So Rob and I did a small version of that. We didn't publish it, but we did it at the time we were doing Spider. No, I'm sorry. Did it at the time. Actually, it was back when we had our 12 instead of our 12 positions instead of 10. And I think that's what helped bring us to 10. But we haven't done published work like you're suggesting that I'm aware of, Rob.
I think that's one of the next steps we've identified, is to actually start taking the body of Tempest tests and looking at what is core and what isn't core. I can tell you I've been playing with this a little bit, not with the specific list. That would it's been a little overwhelming of a task, but is the next step. I think that core is much smaller than people expect based on when I noodle through this, and that's one of the things that is useful to talk about here, right? Well, Swift, I don't know of the deployments I know. Less than half of them use Swift for various reasons, and I've had conversations with people about things like Dashboard, where they're like, I don't use Dashboard. Rackspace doesn't use Dashboard. Is that core if major people using OpenStack don't use Dashboard? Right? So it's easy to come back and think through those things and look at implementation history. Now that we have the user study out, we should actually be able to get some more data back about that too. And you could actually go so far as to look at something like Nova itself and say, well, even Nova, which I think clearly would be a core project in this definition, 100% of the Nova tests won't be must-pass. We're going to end up with a subset of Nova that is must-pass. And so I think that my expectation here is that we're going to end up with a much smaller set of must-pass tests than people expect. And Alan and I have talked about this specifically. We think that the number one response is going to be that there's gaps. There are places where there's tests that people need to be passing, that they rely on capabilities that are missing from the suite, and that we're going to end up in Icehouse with some urgency to fill in those gaps. Once again, back to culture. That's really what we want to see happen. What I want to have happen here is that if I'm a vendor that relies on, and Dell has a product that does this called Multi-Cloud Manager. It used to be in Stratius, similar to RightScale, similar to Scalar, and a lot of these other frameworks that rely on the UI. I would expect that people in that class of vendor and ecosystem would actively write tests that check to make sure the UIs, the APIs they depend on function the way they expect. And those tests should be put into the base, and the more tests we have like that, the stronger OpenStack becomes. Long-winded answer, Jeff. Sorry.
Did we answer it, Jeff, or did we just ramble on?
Guilty. Oh, damn.
I'm very shy. No, I think that you're clearly it's heading in the right direction, but I do think that we need to be a little clearer about the consequences of some of the choices that we're making for the community. Going forward, if we take this particular path, then the following things will happen or will not happen, or the following problems will either be addressed or provoked. And I think that certainly the whole issue of if I'm a vendor trying to put together an OpenStack-based product, what can I do and still counter the fact that I can brand it with OpenStack? That's a very strong commercial concern, and it's a fairly urgent one. And if I'm planning to use React instead of Swift, then I better know very early on when I'm making that commercial decision whether or not I'm putting myself in peril.
That's exactly the type of thing that keeps people up at night right now when they build products on top of OpenStack.
And that's the goal. So I saw two parts in your statement there. The first part where we need to exactly what Rob was talking about. It's going to be an ongoing process of refinement, right? We're going to learn, like you said, we're going to find gaps. But by identifying those, it's going to answer the second part of your statement, where we're going to be able to provide guidance and best practices to the implementers.
So look, let me be in. I'm sort of known for being fairly blunt about OpenStack and the state of the project in these forums. And so one of the things I will say is that I am also concerned that we're taking too long about this. That a quicker and cruder answer might have been a better thing for the project as a whole, that we've been noodling over this for, as you say, many summits. And I can remember those conversations in Boston too. And one of the ongoing things questions I have about OpenStack is, when is it going to get a sense of urgency about some of these things?
Well, my pushback is, and I'll go clear back to the incubation, the Ink Up project. When we started Ink Up, we thought, oh, this is easy. We'll get together with the project leads and we'll just define core and be done, right? We scheduled, I remember we scheduled 3 meetings. And we thought we can cover this in 3 meetings. We'll come back to the board of directors and be done. And all we did was unwrap the onion and realize this is going to take a lot longer. So when we started, we had people saying, "Whoa, you can't solve this that fast. You've got to think about this, community input." So you can argue this both ways.
Yeah, I sympathise. Believe me, I do sympathise with that. I've worked on many open source and standards projects over the years, and it's always much more complicated than you think. On the other hand, I think there is a need to get a high level position established very quickly, so that you can set expectations for where the rest of it's going to go. One other, I don't want to dominate this conversation. So I'll make one more comment and then shut my mic off. But even though you're looking for what you think is going to turn out to be a small core, and you don't want to wind up doing service provider core and carrier core and private cloud core. I think that this also needs to be considered in the context of an ongoing evolution in which those kind of, if not cores, at least profiles, do emerge. And one of the things that I'm seeing, for example, in the work that we're doing on getting our arms around service instances is that service instances have some radically different interpretations for people in the carrier NFV space, where they want applications. They want to have expose an API to manage service instances for applications to manage those instances. On the other hand, there are some people who say, no, this is just an implementation artifact underneath the neutron abstractions or the other abstractions, and we don't. It's not visible to the outside world. You can't have it both ways. You can't be a little bit pregnant here. At some point, there's going to be a set of profiles which say that for internal consistency, the following pieces apply, and the following interfaces do not apply in this other profile, so that we can actually get some internal consistency and testable criteria profiles for different use cases.
I strongly agree with your statements and position. Right, the thing that we found is that in these discussions, our discussions were too big, and a big part of what I think will make this move faster is that we're moving from discussing whether or not a whole project is core or not core into whether or not a single test is core or not core effectively. And so I'm hoping that we can speed things up by making the things we have to discuss and decide about smaller, because what we've seen is that the bigger the topic, the more the easier it is for us to move, harder it is to find consensus. If we come down to individual tests, I think we can move faster, and maybe I'm optimistic, but we're doing a lot of work to make sure people in the community understand this. We vet questions like what you have, that we pressure test it, make sure that it's not going to create adverse repercussions, and then we can move forward. So doing this type of homework is really, really essential in driving the community forward in this, and we hadn't done that to that extent. And I think if you look at places where the board has a swing and a miss, it's when we haven't gotten as much community input as we want, and taken our time to do things. So that ultimately takes longer. As far as the supersets, I fully believe that after we get core established, we're going to run straight into a couple of critical issues that are much more controversial. One of them is supersets of core, so core for hosters, core for private cloud, things like that. I completely expect us to do that. And the other elephant in the room for this is, what do we do with people who pass all the API tests now that we've gone to the trouble of defining a set of tests that you can pass? When somebody who's re-implemented OpenStack in Java, say, passes all the tests and wants to say that they're OpenStack compatible or something like that. Those are critical questions. They're just second phase questions. We won't make progress if we try and define those right now. We have to back burner them, unfortunately. That was a great question.
Thanks.
And by the way, one of the things I take, these questions are exactly, to me, they're a test that the workflow we've put together makes sense to people. You're moving past it. You're not testing the assumptions and the individual statements and positions here. And please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm using people's jumping into the impacts and implementations as evidence that we have a working set of positions.
Well, maybe. So we reserve in any kind of process like this. One of the reasons why you look at the impact and the consequences is to trace it all the way to the end and say, okay, now let's look at the process that we started out early on and see in the light of these consequences, and see whether in fact we could have done something a little better.
Yeah,
it's okay. I mean,
sorry, totally. I'm not asking you to not test it and change, and we'll change it if we need to. The first passes we did at this had system fails, and we couldn't get to the end of we couldn't get all the way through to the impacts. We had fails at the word plugin, or we had fails at we had
we had fails at every step.
Blue screens everywhere you went.
Yeah. I think I'll make one more comment and then shut up, because I really don't want to dominate this one. But core is necessary, but it's not sufficient. There are other governance issues that we need to address within OpenStack, particularly around certain kinds of design constraints, and those will also come into play here.
Yes, and there part of what we identified in Spider was places where the OpenStack is very opinionated about things, and so the hope is that in the definition of core and the focus on tests as sort of the currency here, we can focus on use and operation as sort of the ultimate thing we're judging OpenStack by, and not so much always in the technical implementation. And this is part of the tension that we saw. We're very focused. OpenStack is very focused on how we implemented something. At times, I hear this very clearly. Hey guys, what about an API? What about a reference? What about starting from that point? And we always start with the implementation and then work back to the reference. This actually should relieve some pressure off of that, would be my hope. If does that make sense? I'm trying to state it very carefully.
Yeah.
If you're talking about, and I've heard this, I've heard a lot of opinions on this. I try and represent them all. So if it sounds like I talk against myself, I do, because I'm trying to represent different people's positions. But there's a lot of concern about OpenStack's Python. I'm looking for the right word. Just the fact that we are completely set on Python, and the fact that not everything is implemented in Python yet. So some of what we've done here in alternate implementations does allow people who have non-Python implementations to enter the community in a predictable, safe way.
Well, and we also maybe this is a side note, but we also considered. You mentioned, for example, KVM and Zen. Those projects aren't part of OpenStack, but we had to enable. We recognized that they are key to be able to verify frameworks. So that was part of what added to some of those squares in the flow diagram.
Yep. Yeah, I think that there's always a desire for consistency to try and own as much of this is a complex aggregated project, and you want to try and own as much as you can for consistency. Something you can't own because they pre-exist or they have such a strong external presence. At times, it's going to be necessary to figure out, now we need to let go of this. This is now something where in the past we owned it, but in fact there is now an independent project, an independent community around this and alternatives. And so what we need to do is to move from treating this as part of our internal IP, if you like, in the sense of community IP, to let go of it and let it become its own project and incorporate it by reference, just as we do with the message queue systems and hypervisors.
So you're right, because one of the things, going back to Spider, that's why that whiteboard was so messy, is Rob and I kept identifying these tensions.
Yeah.
Brandon exactly what pointed out, but yet we want to not create, because we already have the culture, but we want to enforce the culture of contribution to the project, and not have things work or go away or whatever. So again, this flow chart is trying to create a balance and relieve that tension.
Yeah. Anybody else got any questions? I don't want this to be just the three of us on there.
Questions are great, but yeah, more voices, more brain. We're doing this, because we want brains on this topic. Think through the impacts.
Is that last step on the upper left, is it really supposed to represent an OpenStack release? like one of the 2 times a year that or can this process happen anytime outside of an OpenStack cycle?
Great question. The expectation is that a release will have a set of tests as part of it that would be marked as part of the release. It wouldn't necessarily be fair to have tests show up post-release, because at that point you might have already certified. So there is an expectation that you would, when we release simultaneously have these are the must-pass tests. It creates some challenges for us in our, actually, maybe more specific. The idea would be that in a release, you would have a set of tests for that release. Since the board actually makes the decision about what is a must-pass test or not, it certifies it. There's some hope that the user committee would be involved in nominating tests as must-pass, or nominating them no longer being must-pass tests, nominating the body of them for a release. But the board would certify that at the board meeting. We seem to always have one before the summit. So before the next design summit, the board would certify these are the must-pass tests. At that point, that would be locked for the release that had just completed, and people could start certifying.
Okay.
And it's important to maybe I'll be wrong on this. I expect the must-pass tests to be a pretty small set in comparison to what we've got. And I also think that there will be people who are ready to certify pretty much on day zero of the release, because we'll know at the RC state what tests are likely to be must pass, and they'll be able, and they should be passing on the reference implementation. So. We've got about 10 minutes to go. I've done this several times with different bodies, and I'd happily go through some of the questions that we've gotten in other groups, and so we can get those out. But I'll pause again to see if other people have direct questions.
Is the idea that like a project that's in incubation would move into the start year stage after incubation? What's the relationship between this and incubation?
Incubation. So projects begin as a program. They go through the DC has defined the incubation process. When they finish incubation, they go into a state which is now called integrated, which is something we knew that was created out of the Meetup project. At that point, we didn't have a clear definition of what we meant by core. So some things were being called core, and some things were kind of nebulous or whatever. So now everything goes into the integrated state, and then it's the board of directors that decides as a determination out of there what is called core. And as Robin pointed out, we're not trying to say complete modules, we're focusing down on the functionality of what's required. But back to your question, everything becomes integrated, not automatically core.
Okay.
One of the things people have noted is that as you get more must-pass tests, you actually have less flexibility and freedom. Being core for some of these innovative projects that are being incubated or just integrated is actually could be a liability in their ability in how well they can make changes and innovate and things like that. But it's all tied together. So the expectation is that projects that are being incubated, one of the things that this definition encourages the TCs to look at is, do they have tests that check that project? Because advancing through the OpenStack integrated release cycle to core is going to require you to have tests that are getting data that we're seeing implementations of and things like that. So they're loosely coupled from the sense that you can do one without the other or vice versa. I think culturally we're trying to drive behaviors in the community that we think encourage a robust, stable, innovative OpenStack project.
Gotcha. Okay.
I'll post. I have TC created a flow diagram. I post that in the IRC.
Good. Yeah, some of the questions we've occasionally gotten on this are about the enforcement. What's going to happen if somebody no longer passes? That generates a lot of interest. We've covered actually a lot of the topics that we normally get to. Very typically, we'll spend a lot of time talking about this requirement, the first blue requirement to have required code. That people have some strong opinions about that on one side or the other, where they think that if you require us to have effectively, we're requiring you to use a Python set of code to run the project. That seems to generate a lot of heat. Of all the things that I expect to get a lot of pressure over time is that one. I think it's necessary right now for us to have that as a position, in part because the community needs it for consensus, and in part because I think it actually helps build OpenStack. And we'll see where we go from there. There was another point and I lost it. Other questions? Yeah, I can't remember what the other point was.
Are there any projects that are in incubation right now, or that are integrated, that would be kind of the first to test this process with? Or have you already talking to them and seeing what they are they interested in going core? And
I have a.
You spoke about some of the downsides, that kind of might constrain some innovation. Sorry.
Yeah, the one that and everybody has different opinions. I've had people come up to me very passionately believing heat should be core, and which maybe I don't know. We need to test these things out. From my position, I look at some of the services like load balancer as a service coming on top, and I expect that it is such a required capability for people to run a scale-out cloud that I would expect something like load balancer as a service to become a core project very quickly because you really need it to use Neutron effectively. So those are things I would expect to see move through incubation really quickly. And actually, that's the place I see the fastest customer adoption of new projects is in some of these XXAS database as a service, load balancer, firewall as a service, things that ride on top of the IaaS infrastructure services. That's my take on the market more than what the community's been telling me as we go through this process. It's been all over the map from community dialogues. Everybody's got favorite projects that they think must be core, and also least favorite projects that they think absolutely shouldn't be core under any circumstances. So the Venn diagram does not overlap on anything except potentially Nova, Cinder, Neutron. Not Keystone isn't a universal. Dashboard's not universal. Glance isn't universal.
See the universal.
It's going to be really an interesting ride as we sort of wind through all these buys and tests, and I do think that we,
I think it's going to be a positive experience though, because it's going to drive alignment, right? As we have discussions on these modules about whether they should be core or not, we're going to be able to come up, as Rob said, we're definitely wanting to leverage a user committee to get their input on what they feel should be core and so forth. So I think we're really back on the community to have them engaged in the discussions and decisions as to what should be core. And I think that's going to be awesome feedback to the project themselves, so that they'll know what needs to be worked on, changed to become a core component for our users. So I think it's a positive direction.
I would extend that to include that this is going to encourage the ecosystem also to play an active part in building these tests and getting involved. So where you have people who don't contribute to Nova per se, but rely on the Nova APIs to operate in a specific pattern, this is where we've got users, we've got ecosystems proxying for users. We're really, I think we're creating a positive hope. The goal is to create a positive environment in which the quality of OpenStack, the stability of OpenStack improves release by release, and incents the people who benefit from it to contribute to it. I can't think of a better way to end it than on what Alan said and those two my statements. So.
Sounds good to me. It's a wrap.
Good, thank you.
It's 8 o'clock here. Thanks, Rob, and Alan.
Thank you all. I appreciate you taking the time. And please, if I do always end on the request to we're happy to continue dialoguing if you have more questions. Bring them up anywhere on the list here, one-on-one, whatever. But make sure you tell people that you've been part of this discussion. We don't want people to feel like they were surprised by some of these things. And that I always charge people when we leave that you're all ambassadors for OpenStack, and please help that people understand what we're trying to accomplish in this aspect. So, thank you.
I assume there will be a session in Hong Kong on this.
Alan?
Actually, our session wasn't accepted. We were one of the.
Maybe at the bar.
It'll have to be following conversation.
We need a better name for it than core or spider. We need it like unicorns dancing on rainbows.
That'll do. Okay, see you in Hong Kong, guys.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Look forward to seeing you there.
Thank you. Bye.
So Robert.